Hello everyone, Oliver G here from the Eiffel Tower. And have you ever thought Paris is a compendium of history? You come here and you're plunged into a whole different culture and lifestyle that goes back millennia. But you can actually go back to see the roots of it. You ever thought that? I'd never thought it. But that's my paraphrasing of a quote from the guest you're about to hear, John Baxter, a long time friend of this podcast. And I love interviewing authors because I suspect they think about the words that they use. Often they think about the way that they talk about things in order to write about it. So sometimes they're very quotable authors because often they've thought things through so well to perfect it on the page. So when you ask them a question, they give you a brilliant answer. And that's what happens in this episode with John Baxter. If you've never heard of him before, he is a long-time Paris resident. He came here in the late 80s. He's from Australia. He hates when I mention the year that he was born. And I think I always do when he's on the show. So I won't do it this time. But I will say that when he came to Europe from Australia, he, in his own words, spent 30 days chugging across the Pacific on a boat. So that might give you an idea of his age. I'm not going to say anything. But this episode, on a personal note, we've been moving house over the past week. And doing that in Paris, especially with a youngster in tow, isn't especially easy. So for this episode, I decided to delve into the back pages of the Eiffel Tower. This episode was actually recorded in 2018, and you won't have heard it probably because I only released it for the Patreon members, the members of this show that keep the cogs turning. And the reason I'm confident that many people haven't listened to it is because that was like when Patreon started. There weren't very many members at all. But the episode still holds. I've listened to it just now. And it's kind of, I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, my thoughts. But this was a series of questions that other Patreon members had sent in to be asked to John specifically. Keep an ear out when he starts talking about his experience with a wall in London because it is extraordinarily relatable for me in Paris. He mentions an awful lot of restaurants. I've checked, they're all still open. If you look at the show notes, I've got their names and addresses below. If you want to find more about John Baxter, the best website for it is johnbaxterparis.com. And he still gives literary walks around the city that are very well received and very special. So you can check out literary walks at the top of his page. Say hi from me if you do. This isn't some kind of commission deal or anything. I just want you to say hi to John Baxter. Let's get straight into the episode. This is John Baxter. A little music from Press Maxon to set the scene. A little thanks to the Patreon supporters, those who sent in these questions all those years ago, and also the Patreon members of today. And push me, prompt me, ask me for more of these extra interviews on Patreon, and I'm happy to do it. I just need a little encouragement. I'll be back at the end to talk a little bit more about this interview, but enjoy the great mind of John Baxter. Let's do it. Okay, John, we're here for the Patreon supporters. How do you feel that interview just went that we did for everybody?
Oh, I'm happy if you're happy.
Yeah, well, I'm happy.
And then I'm happy.
I wonder how many times now we've pressed record and done some kind of chat.
Well, you and I quite often, but the amount of time that I spent doing interviews for radio, I mean, even just in this apartment, I've lost track.
Really?
I just did an interview about Brendan Behan, the Irish writer who used to live over here on Rue Michel-le-Prince. I did one about Charles Boyer, the actor,
right.
Who, of course, associated with this area, and the number I've done about Sylvia Beach, Hemingway.
You go deep into specific characters of history, don't you?
Well, very much. I
Yeah.
mean, I live in this city filled with history.
Yeah.
You can't not be interested.
Whereas when I interview you, I gloss over everything like a glaze on a Thanksgiving
glaze on a donut.
But my questions, forget my questions now. I've got a handful in from the listeners, the Patreon supporters. Some of them quite detailed questions, some just looking for your tips on Paris. I'm just going to go through them all. Okay.
Sure.
So Cal, the first one that came in. My question for John, if you could travel back in time and spend one day in Paris, what year, where would you go, and why?
Ah, yes. Well, it would certainly involve Montparnasse, because that was where all the fun stuff took place within last century, sorry. And I suppose I would go maybe Bastille Day, probably 14 Juillet, 14th of July, in the Select, in about probably 1920 something or other, because then I could have met one of the poets I most admire, Hart Crane, who was a great aficionado of the Select, was always getting drunk there and beating up the waiters and ending up in jail. But he wrote some of the greatest poems that I know, and I would very much like to have spent time with him, even if it meant buying a lot of drinks.
Right, and apologising for the fights. Maybe you would have got in the fights yourself.
I'm not the fighter. I'm a lover, not a fighter. But I could have watched.
Good question, Cal. The next one's from Linda, a new supporter here. She says, it's quite specific here. Could you recommend a restaurant for my daughter and I to celebrate my 70th birthday in December? A place that has character or charm, doesn't have to be the best food.
Well, it depends a lot on money you're prepared to spend, but probably in the modest level, I would say the Mediterranee, which in fact is just up the corner of our street.
The one just
on the Place de l'Odéon. It's quite impressive. The interior is decorated up by Christian Berard, there's some Picasso and Cocteau. Drawings around the Cocteau designed the design that's on the plates and on the china, and so it's a very nice place, seafood restaurant, very elegant, looks out on the Place. If you want to spend a little more money, probably, the place I like is La Pérouse, which is right on the river, very old building. Used to be a brothel, and they have private rooms. So if you like, you can dine en sourdine, as the French say, in seclusion.
Wow!
But the rooms are wonderful because it's a very old building. Tour d'Argent is wonderful as well. You have the duck there, and they give you a card saying this duck is the 217,444th duck.
Oh, wow.
And then they disassemble it before you and turn it into ingredients and then go and cook it and serve it at your table.
Well, there you go, Linda. There's 3 to choose from. Heidi says, I'm just whipping through these now. She says, I'm looking for the best croque monsieur in Paris. If this is an appropriate question for John, please disregard.
The best croque monsieur. Well, I know the best steak tartare is at the Charivari in Montparnasse, so probably their croque monsieur is good as well. I've had it in all sorts of places. The problem now is that increasingly people buy the plasticized version and just heat it up. And that's the trouble. So many restaurants in Paris now go to these pre-prepared dishes. The place where you'd probably get a proper one, I would say the Balzar. Mm-hmm. The Balzar would certainly be the place to start because it's an old-fashioned brasserie, prides itself on everything being maison and artisanal, meaning it's made on the premises by hand. And I would think theirs was certainly competitive, but if I was taking a punt, I'd also try the Charivari because their other dishes are excellent.
Charivari, nice name. Steve chimes in. In Paris, what season of the year do you like best?
The autumn, that's my favourite time. And so this sort of time where it's cool, no rain, but lovely sunsets. That the way the colours change in the sky, you get the greys and pinks rather than the oranges and blues. It's wonderful. It's that time that Verlaine writes about. This is the sort of melancholy time, and it's also the time when Paris comes back to life after the break, after the holidays.
There's new energy in the air.
So the theatres are up again, the concerts and so on. We go to the Philharmonie quite a lot, and this is when their programs start up again. And it's great to walk across that huge park towards that wonderful building. That's great. Doing that in the autumn is one of the great experiences, I think.
There you go. Good question, Steve. Thank you. So Courtney says, what is it about Paris that makes her so enchanting for foreigners? Her.
Well, Paris is a woman. Yes, they say France is the woman of Europe. I suppose that means Paris is the woman of France. What makes it so enchanting? Gosh, that's an imponderable, isn't it? It isn't enchanting for everybody. A lot of the French don't like Paris.
True.
They say, Paris is not France.
True, yeah.
I think it appeals to people like us who come from younger countries, that because Paris is a compendium of history, a compendium of millennia of history. So you come here and you're plunged into a whole different culture and lifestyle that goes back. You can actually go back to see the roots of it. I never felt that in London. I always felt that London was always moving on, changing things a lot, tearing things down, building things. The West End of London at the moment is like a building site. Here, things are preserved. Every one of this building here, it's 1760. And from the outside, it's just exactly the way it was. This apartment dates back, in this configuration, back into the late 19th century. All the buildings around here are the same. You really feel you're taking on an existing culture. And that's, of course, not something you ever feel in California.
Well, I was going to say, compared to Australia, because you and I from Australia, no building is as old as this very building we're sitting in. Does that still sort of, trip your mind a little bit?
Give you a frisson? Yes, it did. I remember the first night I spent getting off the boat. Once had to get to England from Australia by boat.
I don't remember that, but I take your word for it.
Me and Clive James, 30 days on a boat, chugging across the Pacific. Anyway, I got to Southampton and I walked up the street that evening, and there was a roundabout, and in the middle of the roundabout was a piece of Roman wall, and I walked over and I put my hand on that Roman wall and I bent down. I was an Australian. When I straightened up, I was a European.
I like it. That's lovely. I'm a bit. The other day, I was passing a park down on the right bank, sort of on the just across from Ile Saint Louis, I guess. And I know that there's a chunk of the Bastille is in one of the parks there. Have you seen that before? And I was riding past on the scooter, and I just parked it just to go and look at it. And I thought, kind of a weird thing to do, to just jump off the scooter to go and look at wall, but I guess I'm the same as you.
Well, yeah.
There's a couple more questions. One from Alex, and he says, I'm fascinated by the history and the mystique of La Pérouse. There you go. The famed left bank restaurant on Quai des Grands Augustins. Yeah, that's what we were talking about. He says, have you dined there? If so, what was it like, and do you have any good stories about it and its clientele? Funny it comes back up.
Well, yes, I have dined there a number of times. I've even dined in one of their private rooms with a lady of my acquaintance, and I described this event in my book about Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So I urge you to get a copy of that, because it was quite a piquant evening. The upstairs rooms are all private. Some are very small, just for 2 people. Some are larger. You can have 8 or 10 people if you want. You can have a dinner party. But we actually chose the Liane de Pougy room, named for the great courtesan Liane de Pougy. And of course, the waiter never just comes in; he knocks at the door,
really?
So you can admit him. And it has lovely, very soft, large banquettes covered in red velvet. And on the wall is a mirror, and the mirror is so scratched that you can hardly see yourself in it. Traditionally, these scratches were made by women who were offered jewels in return for their favours. And before they actually succumbed, they would scratch the mirror to make sure it really was a diamond and not glass. Wow. Yes, that was one particular meal with a friend. I recommend that highly. If you have a partner who is of a liberal frame of mind, it can be extremely amusing and a little sort of naughty. If you have 3 or 4 people, yes, you could take another room. You could also traditionally you could hire a violinist to come and play. And if you liked, you would arrange for him to be blindfolded so he couldn't see what was happening.
What is this madness? Is this expensive to get into?
No, it's not that expensive actually, compared to some of the bigger places. Compared to Théavon or Luca Carton, no, it's quite modest.
Mm.
But the main restaurant is also, this is an old brothel basically. It was, for a while it was a brothel, then it was a wine shop, and then the rooms upstairs were originally servants' rooms. So when it went over to being a restaurant, they have a bar on the ground floor where you wait to meet your partner or get your table. You go up to the first floor, which is where the dining rooms are, and then the next floor is where the private rooms are. The dining rooms are very attractive. My sister-in-law used to run the. This is a rather long answer to the question.
So it's a good question.
Yeah, very good. Very good. My sister-in-law used to run New York University here, and she rang me up and she said, "Have you ever heard of a woman named Kitty Carlisle Hart?" And I said, "Well, yes, of course." Married to Moss Hart, was originally a movie actress, then was a participant in these TV game shows for many years. And she said, "Oh, well, she's coming over to Paris. She's an alumna and apparently a very important figure in the New York University hierarchy, and she's leading a group and I wanted to find something to entertain them. What do you suggest?" I said, "Well, what would you usually do?" And she said, "Oh, well, I'd probably take them around the Eiffel Tower and so on." I said, "Well, I happen to know that Kitty Carlisle Hart graduated from the Sorbonne, so she probably won't want to see." And in the end, we decided that she would hold a dinner at La Pérouse. And there's a wonderful big room looking out on the river, all decorated up with paintings to do with exploration and so on. La Pérouse, the explorer. Mm. I think it's even called it's named after some piece of naval equipment. Anyway, I was asked to give a little introductory talk, and I said, well, I'm fortunate enough to have actually seen Miss Hart, our guest of honour, in her first movie, which is called Murder at the Vanities. And I said, and I've been able to satisfy something that I really wanted to know for 50 years in that film, which is set in the George White's Vanities, the New York Big Show. There is over the entrance of the performers, it said, "Through these doors walk the most beautiful women in the world." And so I'm now glad to see that it was perfectly true. And Miss Hart said, "Oh, dear boy, come and sit next to me." And so we spent the whole meal gossiping, and she invited me to visit her in New York, and I did this and had a wonderful morning inspecting her incredible apartment. Wow. Filled with theatrical memorabilia.
Wow.
So, no, really, the La Pérouse, the food is all right. It's served with great ceremony and so on, but it's more decorative than.
It doesn't sound like anyone's going for the food.
No, you wouldn't go for the food. It's perfectly all right, but that's not its main claim to fame. It's the ambience, the decor, the history. But I do recommend that Alex, that you look at my book about Saint-Germain-des-Prés, because there's a long section about La Pérouse.
There you go. Maybe he's already read it.
No.
So 2 more questions, and then we're done. And one is from Jack Springer. He says, "You've surely already told the story of why you came to Paris, but why did you stay in Paris?"
Well, I suppose I was too poor to leave. Why did I stay? Well, because the very first book I did here was the biography of Federico Fellini, and that did so well. It made me believe that I could make a new professional life in Europe Whereas when I left Los Angeles, I really did wonder how I could survive here, and I didn't particularly want to live off my wife. So, but luckily, the success of that book showed me that I could write biographies of film people based in Paris and do my research going around the world, and that turned out to be the case because I did Buñuel in Spain and in Mexico. I did Spielberg back in Los Angeles, and then I did, of course, De Niro in New York, and so on. So, in fact, it turned out that Paris is a very good place to be a writer, and so there was no real incentive to move.
Okay, and last question here from Ruth. She says, if you had to look in your crystal ball, what would be the best time in someone's life to move to Paris?
Well, as some obscure writer said, Paris is a movable feast. The best time, well, I suppose, it's the old thing, if youth only knew, if age only could. I've found moving here in middle age was a very good thing. I'd already sown my wild oats. I'd already had established myself in my profession, so I could now enjoy the fruits of that. I didn't have to struggle. I didn't have to fight for anything. I could enjoy it, and so I suppose it made me into a kind of sybarite. Up until then, I'd been, a very aggressive, pushing ahead. Once I got here, I kind of coasted a bit. Wife and I had a child, which was an interesting experience, and also I started to write something different. I got interested in music again. I started to travel around. I got interested in European culture. All those things I never would have done before. So probably 35 is a good age, I think. 35 to 40, probably a good time to come here.
All right, there you go. There are all the questions answered from the Patreon supporters. Thank you for supporting. Thank you, John, for giving me your time.
Always a pleasure.
There you have it, John Baxter himself, recorded in 2018 in his apartment. I've removed it from this episode, actually, but there were a few mentions of the Australian Embassy event, the big Australian Embassy event that I talked about in my book, Paris on Air. It was me and him. I interviewed him at that event, so we were sort of promoting that in that episode. It's quite cool to listen back. I so rarely listen back to my old episodes, so it's especially interesting for me, given that in the past 4 or 5 years I've experienced so much of Paris. So when he's talking about La Pérouse, for example, when I recorded this, I had no idea what he was talking about. Since I've been there twice, and I can tell you, the 2 times that I've been there was nothing piquant, nothing spicy about our evenings compared to when John went there. Although I think I do remember him talking about, I remember thinking about that diamonds in the mirror thing, so that really stuck with me. And a lot of the other restaurants he mentioned I've been to too. So including La Méditerranée, which I ate at with John himself. And once again, really interesting to go back and listen to an old episode, and really glad for me to hear that it still holds up, like those old ones. There's a risk. I mean, some of the episodes I've done, the companies have closed down, the restaurant has closed down, or whatever, the attraction doesn't exist anymore. But I think there's an idea in revisiting some of these really old episodes, because there's some good stuff out there, and it deserves to be heard. So, more on John Baxter, as I said, johnbaxterparis.com, where you can also do his literary tours. You could support the Earful Tower podcast if you enjoy it. It's patreon.com/the Earful Tower. Over the years, there's been so many different bonuses. You could spend probably weeks and weeks delving into it all. And as I said, I could be encouraged quite easily to do more podcast episodes if that's what you'd like behind the scenes, because it's quite fun to read your questions to the guest like this. This specific bonus episode came after I'd done another interview with John. back in the day. On a much more current note, a little cane update. I could be giving these regularly. For those who are new or who haven't been watching or following on social media, the canes that I found in the bin or in the trash can in Paris, that story also went viral on TikTok. For some reason, these cane stories go ballistic on TikTok. Millions. If you add it up, it must be 10 million hits now. And a lot of new followers who appear to be very different to the typical followers on Instagram and Facebook when you search the Eiffel Tower. You know, Paris lovers who are familiar with my show and familiar with me. On TikTok, the comments are a bit more like, yeah, right, bro. As if you found those canes. You just planted them there. Or, this guy doesn't know how to play a violin cane. There's a lot of attitude on there, and I must say it's a bit of an eye opener after all the lovely back and forths that we have on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube. So find your audience. I think most of the listeners to this show will find their sort of like-minded Francophile Eiffel Tower fan audiences on Facebook and Instagram. But do whatever suits you best. I hope to see you over there. Search for the Eiffel Tower, follow along, and if you really like it, patreon.com/the Eiffel Tower. Speaking of listeners, speaking of patrons, and speaking of ways to get in contact, you can always email. Oliver@theeiffeltower.com is one very good way to do it. And I got one email in this week from Adrienne Charles in Tasmania, the self-proclaimed oldest listener of the Eiffel Tower podcast. And just a special shout out to Adrienne, who we met actually when we did the Australia book tour. Lovely lady. And she says she's been very sick, very, very sick, and has been in hospital. She adds that after this intense hospital visit, she caught up on all the podcasts in a row and found the cane one to be particularly interesting. Funnily enough, she says, in the rehab gym, they have a lot of canes which they use on the floor for patients to walk between while holding onto rails. I'll look more closely at them now, she says, but I doubt I'll find one with a gun hidden inside. Well, who knows, Adrienne? Keep spinning those cane handles, everybody. And Adrienne, I hope you get better really soon. In fact, everybody at the Eiffel Tower community does. Merci beaucoup for this week. I'll see you again next time. I'm Oliver G. This is the Eiffel Tower podcast. That was John Baxter, and I want you to have a lovely week. Au revoir.